Thanks, Brother Dave. Well, good morning, brothers and sisters and young people. Thank you so much for your warm invitation to be with you again. We love coming to Moorebank, and particularly when you have not only all these wonderful, smiling, friendly faces, but you hear a wonderful letter like that read out. Josh, that was probably the best exhortation anyone's going to hear this morning. Well, brothers and sisters, our readings have taken us to so many powerful passages. In fact, I was just saying to Brother Stuart earlier, I had a little bit of trouble trying to work out what I actually wanted to exhort on today, because in the New Testament, Luke 11, the Lord's Prayer, there's so many wonderful things that even Brother David mentioned in the life of Christ that we could look at. Our readings in the Psalms take us from Psalm 143 and 144, and 144 is, of course, the battle psalm of David with David and Goliath, and what a magnificent little section of scripture we could look at there. And you might be wondering, well, why have I taken Numbers as the exhortation this morning? Well, I thought, brothers and sisters, we could call our exhortation Numbers with the Transgressors, but I thought you might take that a little bit personally that I was referring to you at Moorebank. But don't worry, we're going to actually look at what I believe to be the theme of this book, and that is let God lead. I believe the power of this book is actually about how God was going to work amongst that people, not only in a literal way, but in a spiritual way as well, in taking them out of captivity. And I love that phrase in your letter, Josh, where you actually said the idea of God guiding your life, because ultimately this is the book of Numbers. So when we have a think about this idea of let God lead, in order to sort of build up to what we read this morning in Numbers chapter 10, I'd like us to look a little bit of context first, brothers and sisters. And in order to do that, I'd like you to come back with me to the book of Exodus, because the Exodus starts in Exodus, but really Numbers is actually the record of that Exodus. It's actually them leaving and going out, and it's actually the wilderness wanderings in this entire book. So let's just come back to Exodus chapter 3, because here we actually see God tell them what it was that he was wanting them to understand about his work in their generation. And here in Exodus chapter 3, we know this really well because it's the burning bush. It's where God, through the angel, the Yahweh angel, appears to Moses, and he tells Moses that God has heard their cry. And you know, brothers and sisters, when we think about that and what Brother Pete mentioned in his prayer, it's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes we do struggle with life's challenges and the difficulties, and we sometimes wonder, where is God in these challenges? And why isn't God involved in my life? And where is God leading me in all of this? And yet, brothers and sisters, here Moses was told that God does hear our cry, and he is at work in our life. And even in the darkest moments, God is actually taking us through the valley of the shadow of death, that we might learn to trust him, that we might learn about his leadership, and particularly learn about what he wants to do in our life. And so here, this is the message that the angel actually brings. And so he's told to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. But have a look here in verse 6, because God immediately appears to him and introduces himself as the God of thy father. Now that's fascinating, brothers and sisters, because when God reveals himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, what we're immediately told is to think about the lives of the patriarchs, but particularly how God worked in their life. Because the life of Abraham and the life of Isaac and the life of Jacob was not an easy walk in the park for them. It wasn't something that we could look back and go, well, it was easy for them and hard for us. In a sense, what's encapsulated is the life of a person who was told to get out of your family and from your kindred and go to a land that I'm going to show you, but you don't yet see it. And they had to trust that God was going to be leading them through those moments. And yet, brothers and sisters, it's also the fact that he's a God of promise. So when God makes a promise, there's an absolute certainty that he's going to fulfill that if they put their trust that God would lead them to that land of promise. Now, notice the key phrases, though, through this chapter that God is actually trying to demonstrate. Look particularly at verse 12. And God says, certainly I will be with thee. Now, even in Moses' fear here about what he was witnessing and what he was just about to obviously lead the people through, God was giving him the absolute certainty that he would be their guide and he would be their lead through the wilderness wanderings. That God was going to take them out of Egypt, and there he would bring them out as a people that they might serve him. And of course, then we know the interaction between God and Moses, where then God reveals his name, that he would be who he would be. And truly, God would be with that nation, and God would lead them forth. And they had to understand that this was such a significant part of God's character that he memorialized it in his name for all generations, that the God who led Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be the God who would lead that nation. Interesting little aside, and we'll come back to it. Do you notice in verse 18, he actually says, "And they shall hearken to thy voice, and thou shalt come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt, and say unto him that Yahweh, Elohim of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness." Now remember those 3 days, because they came up in our reading in Numbers chapter 10. And remember the phrase, into the wilderness. Because brothers and sisters, the actual book of Numbers in the Hebrew is not called Numbers, it's actually called in the wilderness. That's actually the theme of the Hebrew Bible. So the original book of Numbers was not called Numbers, it was actually called in the wilderness. Now just come across to Exodus chapter 6 while we're in Exodus, and see how God is developing Moses to appreciate the divine leadership that would occur. And here again is the interaction between God and Moses. And it says in verse 2, "I am Yahweh." And he tries to demonstrate that the name of Yahweh now is the covenant name. It's a name of promise by which, although the patriarchs understood God more as a nourisher and a destroyer in that sense, now they had to see that he had established a covenant with his people, and he was with absolute certain going to bring about those promises. But have a look in verse 6, and it's worth coloring in if you've got a pencil there. When he declares himself to be Yahweh in verse 6, notice how the name of God now comes out strongly. Look at this in verse 6. "I will bring you out. I will rid you of their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm." Verse 7, "I will take you to me for a people. I will be to you a God, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh." Verse 8, "I will bring you into the land concerning which I did swear. I will give it to you." Brothers and sisters, when we let God lead, the certainty of those promises is not just something that he wants us to focus on. It's also the fact that God will be leading us through each of those moments that we might have doubt about when we do go through those dark moments. And of course, you can see in verse 9, "Moses spake unto the children of Israel, but they hearkened not unto Moses for anguish of spirit and cruel bondage." And we can feel like that at times, brothers and sisters. We don't know what God is doing in our life, but the bondage and, in a sense, the struggle that we have. Well, what is God doing in our life? Why won't he take away these difficulties? Well, brothers and sisters, there might be a time where he's actually leading us through the wilderness to cause us to trust him. And we need to see that this certainty of God is here as part of his name. Now, I want you to pick up one little thing, brothers and sisters, and it comes out here as the first mention in verse 26. In Exodus chapter 6, God says, "These are Aaron and Moses, to which Yahweh said, bring out the children of Israel from the land of Egypt." Now, notice this, "according to their armies." That's a rather strange sort of thing. Wouldn't you be wanting to bring the children of Israel out? But why call them according to their armies? And it's often translated armies or host. Now, the second occurrence of this word armies is in the next chapter, in Exodus chapter 7. Just have a look where Yahweh is actually trying to tell Moses that he's going to be, in a sense, an Elohim, a God to Pharaoh. He then says in verse 4, "But Pharaoh will not hearken to you." Now, why? "That I may bring forth mine armies and my people." Brothers and sisters, what God is actually telling Moses here is he's not just going to rescue his people, he's going to rescue his armies, his host. And the people of Israel, although here slaves, were in a sense going to be part of the host and armies of Almighty God. Because God was going to be their leader. God was going to be the commander in chief, that he would go before them. Now, the word armies is actually mentioned only on 3 other occasions in the book of Exodus. Just quickly come across to Exodus 12. And what's beautiful is it's here in and around the Passover. And that, brothers and sisters, is what we're coming to remember this morning. We're coming to remember Yahweh's Passover, where he led us forth that we might be part of his host and his armies. And the 3 occasions that it's mentioned here in Exodus chapter 12, the first one is in verse 17. Notice where it is actually in the context of the Passover. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought forth your armies out of Egypt. It's mentioned again in verse 41. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the host of Yahweh went forth. And that's our same word, armies. And here, brothers and sisters, in Exodus chapter 12 is actually the beginning of the Exodus. This is where Israel were now to leave Egypt behind and they were to go forth. And that's exactly what verse 51 says. And it came to pass in the selfsame day that Yahweh did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies, by their hosts. Now, you might say, so what? What's the point of this word? Well, brothers and sisters, it's only mentioned 5 times in the book of Exodus, but it's mentioned 71 times in the book of Numbers, because that is the focus of the book of Numbers. So let's just go to Numbers chapter 1 for a minute, because if you think about what God is trying to do, he's trying to develop his people and taking them out of captivity. And he's then going to show them how he is going to lead them. He will certainly lead them and bring them to that place. And then if you think about the book of Leviticus, which is between Exodus and Numbers, the book of Leviticus is all about God's holy, just, and good law. Because what he was trying to teach them is that this idea of an army and a host was first a moral and a spiritual army, that it was about their connection to God spiritually. And so therefore in Leviticus, we're defined all the things that God was trying to teach them about his moral principles. And again, it was the law of God that David says was to lead him. David talks about how it was the meditation in the law of God daily that was what he would let trust and lead him through his difficulties and his challenges. But now when we get to the book of Numbers, brothers and sisters, have a look particularly at verse 1 through to 3. It says that Yahweh spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. Now that phrase, in the wilderness, is actually the Hebrew phrase for the book of Numbers. That's the title of the book of Numbers in the Hebrew, in the wilderness. And here it says, in the tabernacle of the congregation on the first day of the 2nd month. Now, if you think about Exodus, from Exodus 12 through to Exodus chapter 40, Moses is given all the tabernacle, all its patterns, and it's therefore, in a sense, reared up. And here we are only in the 2nd month that the book of Numbers starts. And they're coming out into the wilderness of Sinai. Now, in the wilderness is actually the phrase that gets the book of Numbers split into 3 main divisions. Chapters 1 to 10 is in the wilderness of Sinai, as it says here in verse 1. From chapters 13 to 19, we have the wilderness of Paran. And then from chapter 22 to chapter 36 is the wilderness of Moab, right at the very end. Now, there's 3 wildernesses, in a sense, that the book of Numbers records. And the book of Numbers records 38 years of history. And yet, in the first 10 chapters, it's approximately 20 days of time. And then in the latter part of the book of Numbers, it's the final few months of the 38 years. And we have only one event in the book of Numbers that is recorded of that 38 years in the wilderness. In other words, brothers and sisters, the main bulk of the 38 years is absolutely silent in Scripture as to what took place. It's as if God erased that from the record of Scripture. So what God is doing here in these first 10 chapters is therefore quite significant. So let's keep reading in verses 2. It says, now take a sum of the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by their house of their fathers with the number, and that's a key word that's now going to come through the book of Numbers, with the number of their names, every male according to their polls or according to their head. Now that word number there, brothers and sisters, is the Hebrew word mispah, which means a definitive number. as if you're numbering people. But look at the next verse. It says, from 20 years old and upward, all that were able to go forth to war. Now, that's our Hebrew word for hosts or armies that we found was used 5 times in the book of Exodus. And they're the ones that are being called forth to go forth to war, to battle. And it says, thou and Aaron, now notice this, shall number them according to their armies. Now, that word number is a different word to the word in verse 2. It's actually the word that means to muster or to visit. And it's the same word used in Exodus 34, where it says that God is merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting, there's our key word, visiting or numbering the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And again, we have this word, visiting them by their armies. So this word armies or host is used twice in this verse, as if to say, brothers and sisters, that God is bringing them out, each one individually known by God, collected together as a group of people for a very special warfare. You see, this is the entire crux of the book of Numbers, that God was going to lead them through a very special kind of warfare that was going to take place. You might think, well, that's a little bit strange. Why would this be a book about warfare? Well, a few little hints that we get. For instance, if we just have a flick through the first few chapters of Numbers, let's see how remarkable this is. And we might get a little picture of what the warfare is that God is actually trying to demonstrate. Now, if you did have a pen to colour through, and we don't have time to do it in an exhortation, but I would encourage you to follow that word armies or war through the book of Numbers, because it's going to highlight some really powerful things. For instance, as you go through chapter 1, do you notice that this entire nation is organised and numbered according to a set arrangement? So, for instance, the word number and numbered appears all the way through, those 2 different words. You can colour them all the way through the chapter. And you notice that it starts, for instance, if you have a look at verse 17, Moses and Aaron, they take the men and they're expressed by names. And on the first day of the 2nd month, they're all brought together by their families. All the heads are gathered together to number them, according to what verse 2 says, according to their polls. Verse 19, and Yahweh commanded Moses to number or to visit them or to tally them up in that sense in the wilderness of Sinai. And here we have now the children of Reuben. So now we have Israel ordered according to Reuben, Simeon, etc. And every one of them has this word war in it. For instance, verse 20, all that were able to go forth to war. Simeon, verse 22, all that are able to go forth to war. And it says that of all the tribes as it goes through, they're numbered, they number them, and they go forth to war. This whole chapter is about organizing the children of Israel according to this arrangement. But look at verse 47. There's a notable tribe that's left out. It says, but the Levites, after the tribe of their fathers, were not numbered. In fact, the word warfare is not mentioned of the Levites here in these early chapters. All the other tribes are arranged according to this, except the Levites. And we're told in verse 54, the Levites had to keep the charge. And there's another little theme that as we go through our readings in Numbers, colour it in, because there's something about the charge of the Levites that is particularly important. Now, then in chapter 2, not just their order of their marching, but the order of where they were to camp as well. And how they were to camp when they were together was the east side, the south side, the north side, the west side. They're all arranged around in a very special order. And again, you'll notice in chapter 2, the Levites are not included in that. Verse 33, but the Levites were not numbered amongst the children of Israel. So the Levites again are separated out. And you think, why? Why are the Levites being left out? Well, in chapter 3, now we have the Levites mentioned. So all the nation is ordered according to their structure and how they were to camp. And they're all talked about the armies or the hosts. But so far, the Levites haven't been included. So when we get to chapter 3, verse 7, they're told to keep the charge of the whole congregation, to do the service in the tabernacle. Verse 8, the charge again, the service of the tabernacle. There's a different emphasis here of the Levites. But verse 9, thou shalt give the Levites unto Aaron and his sons. They are wholly given. So now the Levites are dedicated to God and the service of the people, because in verse 12, the Levites are mine. So as if there's some sort of special thing being focused upon here, because the Levites were really to be the center of this nation. And in fact, in this chapter where they're told to pitch now in their camp is right at the very center on various sides of the tabernacle. And again, to do the service. And in the end of this chapter, once we get to verse 41, we're told that they were to take the Levites for God. And they would be numbered. And that's the first time now the numbering of the people is linked to the idea of the Levites. And in verse 45, the Levites would be taken instead of the firstborn. And so this beautiful little picture at the end of chapter 3 about the redemption of the Levites is mentioned. And the redemption money, which is picked up again in the New Testament because God was going to give them to Aaron. Well, brothers and sisters, now in chapter 4, for the very first time, we have the word armies used in reference to the Levites. And it's here in chapter 4, verse 3. All that enter into the host, there's the word armies, to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation, this is their service. So the Levites now are first mentioned as part of this host, or part of this war in this chapter, but their service is highlighted particularly in verse 23. Just come to verse 23. It says, for from 30 years old and upward until 50 years old, thou shalt number them, all that enter in to perform the service and to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, if you have a King James, brothers and sisters, look in the margin, and some other translations might actually more correctly put the word here, because that word armies is mentioned twice there in that verse. It hasn't been mentioned much in terms of the Levites at this point in time, but now we're told that it actually means to war a warfare. In other words, the Levites were separated by God in this special service to have a special host, a special warfare that they were meaning to be carrying out. And you scratch your head and you go, well, what were the Levites supposed to be doing? You can get the idea that the rest of the nation was going to be prepared to go into battle as they went into the land. But why the Levites and why their special service? And in fact, the word service through the rest of this chapter, verse 30, verse 35, verse 39, verse 43, is all our Hebrew word for armies. And they had a special warfare, a special service, a special army in a sense. You think, what's the point of that? Well, the very next chapter in chapter 5, brothers and sisters, is all about that there should be no lepers or moral defilement in the camp. Then in chapter 6, we have the Nazirite Vow. And the Nazirite Vow was, and just think of why this is positioned here. If you were a Levite and you were watching all the numbering going on, you'd be sort of feeling a bit left out. Like the whole nation is being numbered in front of you and you're being put in the army of God, and you'd be sitting there going, what's our role? You'd kind of want to be like them, where, you know, you're going to be in the army and in the battle. But now, brothers and sisters, chapter 6 is actually about the idea of separation of the Nazirite vow, which is actually whether the people can be like the Levites, and particularly the high priest. In other words, what God is highlighting is that the most important battle is the warfare of the Levites. And if anyone of the nation wants to separate themselves and be like them, even the greatest of the Levites in that sense, the high priest, then the Nazirite vow was to be the way in which they could be numbered with them. And so again, what we get in chapter 7 is God reiterating how he's given the Levites to the people so that they could understand the warfare that they're meant to be a part of. And in chapter 8, the Levites were first given to God. I'm sorry, I'm summarizing this pretty quickly because hopefully in your readings, you'll work through this and pick some of this up as we go. You can see that the Levites, as we see in chapter 8, were taken from among the children of Israel, and then they were cleansed and sanctified. And in verse 11 of chapter 8, Aaron shall offer the Levites unto Yahweh for an offering of the children of Israel, that they may execute, notice this, the service of Yahweh, the warfare of Yahweh. Romans picks it up in chapter 12, where he talks about us presenting our bodies as living sacrifices. In other words, the Levites were meant to be leading the people. In what? In the moral principles of God. You see, the warfare, brothers and sisters, that God was trying to highlight in this chapter was an issue of leadership, of divine leadership amongst this nation. And that's why, for instance, in chapter 8, they are wholly given unto me, verse 16. Verse 19, I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron for this purpose. And at the end of chapter 8, and this is where our word comes up again, that phrase, to wait upon the service of Yahweh. If you look in your margin, it means to war a warfare. There's our word of armies used twice again. In other words, the Levites were given to God that they might teach the people that there was a battle and a warfare that had to take place. And it was the warfare about the temple. You think, well, what's the battle they had to fight? The battle, brothers and sisters, was the battle of letting God lead in their life. And that's what chapter 9 is about. Because in the wilderness, God established that a cloud that existed over the tabernacle was a preeminent sign of God's presence in their life and of God's leadership in their life. And at nighttime, he was there as well, but in a pillar of fire. As if in the daytime, they could see something so very clear, and at nighttime, they could see something so very clear that no matter where they were, God was the center and focus of their life. And it says, when that lifted, you had to walk no matter how far, wherever it walks. If it goes 1 day, if it goes 10 days, if it goes, you follow it. And when it stops, you suddenly all get back around it and you camp and you put your host in order around it. And if it was to move, you were to move. If it was to stop, it was to stop. Why? Because God was teaching them, let God lead. Follow God's direction in all things. You don't know whether it's for 1 day or 2 days that you might be moving, but be prepared to move when that moves. And so therefore, when we come to chapter 10, notice again that this word armies picks up multiple times in this chapter. Now, we read here about how it came to pass. Look at verse 11. On the 20th day of the second month. Can you see that we've only had 20 days now between chapter 1 and chapter 10? All this organization has taken place in 20 days. And the children of Israel are going to take their journey out into the wilderness of Sinai. So here is the record of the book of Numbers. And in verse 14, we're told that the very first thing that should lead as the camp was to move was, of course, the tribe of Judah. And notice this, according to their armies. Then we have host again in verse 15, the host of Zebulun. So you've got Judah, Issachar, then Zebulun. And look at verse 17. Here in the middle, where the tabernacle was taken down, were the Levites, the sons of Gershon and the sons of Merari. And then further after, you can see in verse 21, it's the Kohathites. So here's this order of how they were to march. And smack bang in the middle of this nation were the Levites and the tabernacle and the ark. Because God was going to be leading that nation into the promised land. Now we get to our climax in verse 28, brothers and sisters, where it says, thus were the journeyings of the children of Israel according to their armies. So there's our key word again, when they set forward. So after this, brothers and sisters, in chapter 10, we have, in a sense, 4 chapters that are quite significant. Chapter 11 is where the people don't trust God's leadership. And of course, they fell to the idea of lusting after the food, the lust of the flesh. Then we have chapter 13, where Miriam and Aaron challenge the leadership, the pride of life. And in chapters 13 and 14, we have the spies want to go into the land. And of course, in their failure to trust God's leadership, they try to spy out the land. And of course, the failure of the nation caused for another 38 years for them in the wilderness to journey around. And there's the lust of the eyes. What is that telling us, brothers and sisters? It's telling us that the whole idea of the armies being gathered together was because the warfare they had to fight was the warfare of sin and death that originated in their own hearts and minds. You see, that's why the Levites had to be the central focus. Their warfare was more important than any of the other warfare that they were about to embark on. And it had to be first a conquering of sin and death in their own hearts and minds. And let's go back to this little section in chapter 10, brothers and sisters, because I think it's a beautiful exhortation that the people had to never forget. And unfortunately, we know from the events that took place they did. But just let's focus on this last part of Numbers 10 for our exhortation this morning, because here is an amazing lesson about God's leadership and what he was doing in this warfare and what he's called us to be, brothers and sisters. You know, our brother David mentioned the idea of our names being written in heaven, numbered, individually known by God. He's called us to be part of his army, his host, to have a spiritual warfare. And he's called us to the wilderness, brothers and sisters, because that's where the voice of God cries. That's where the voice will cry that all flesh is grass and only the word of God will live forever. It's only out in the wilderness, away from the cares of life, away from all the distractions and the technology and all of our, wanting to do this and that and our careers and our holidays and all that, will we finally listen to the voice of God about the warfare that we need to be involved with. And it's here that in the wilderness, we have this beautiful message of God's leadership take place. Now, I want you to notice, brothers and sisters, that Moses invites his father-in-law, Hobad, to join Israel and the promises to Abraham. We don't have time to look at that, but there's a beautiful theme that starts here, and its course ends all the way down in the legacy of the Rechabites later in Jeremiah. And it's a worthwhile discussion, but we don't have time to look at it this morning. I want to focus particularly, brothers and sisters, on what Moses was trying to do. Because when he says, God has spoken good concerning Israel in verse 29, when he spoke to Hobad, in trying to encourage him to join with Israel, he actually tried to encourage them to come along, because it says at the end of verse 31, that thou mayest be to us instead of eyes. I'd love your thoughts on this afterwards, brothers and sisters, whether this was Moses in a moment of weakness or doubt, or whether this was an attempt just to bring him into the fold. But what I find is very interesting, although Moses was totally confident in the promises and the goodness that God would do unto them, God immediately responds in a way that's slightly different. Did you notice in verse 33 that when they departed from the Mount of Yahweh, 3 days' journey, it says the ark of Yahweh went before them. God led the children of Israel in their first movement. Now, if you link that back to this chapter, back in verse 17 and 21 of Numbers 10, we were just told that the ark was to come in the middle of the people. In fact, the very first time they move, God goes against the very order that he's just established. Rather strange, isn't it? And you know, there's only 2 occasions in the whole Bible where God actually caused the ark to go in front to lead the people. The first occurrence is here, as they left, okay, and here where we have this wonderful promise, rise up, O Yahweh, let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And then when it rested, return, O Yahweh, to the many thousands of Israel. There's another occurrence where this takes place. And I'd like you to come with me, an apt passage for this morning in the book of Joshua. So let's come to Joshua, just quickly to Joshua chapter 1, and see how God actually, again, takes this idea of leadership in taking the people now into the promised land. So the very first time that he leads the people out, and interestingly, the very first time he leads them into the nation. So this second occasion here is in the book of Joshua. And we notice particularly in Joshua 1, verse 2, we know that Moses had died. And so he comes to Joshua and says that although Moses has died, that now he would actually be with you, Joshua. I'm going to be with you, Joshua. You're going to carry on, this mantle that Moses as leader was. But notice this in verse 3, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread, that have I given to you. And as I said unto Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And you'll hear the echo of the Abrahamic promises in there. Notice in verse 5, there shall not be any man be able to stand before you all the days of your life. because as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. What's he telling Joshua? Let God lead in your life. As I was with Moses, I will lead you. So be strong and courageous. Look at verse 9. Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be dismayed, for Yahweh thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. Let God lead. So when you come across to chapter 3, as the people come in, and we're running out of time, I'm very sorry, that they were at Shittim, it says, that in verse 3, they commanded the people saying, when you see the Ark of the Covenant, notice that, the Ark of the Promise, the Ark of the Covenant, and the priests and the Levites bearing it, when you see them move from their place, then you go after it. So here's the other occasion now where the ark was to go before the people. Look at verse 6. Joshua says unto the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant, pass over, notice this, before the people. And they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went before the people. God was going to now lead them into the promised land. As God had led them into the wilderness and he would be with them through those moments, so here God was going to lead them into the promised land, that God would be amongst them. And what is beautiful about this, and again, we don't have time to explore it, but this chapter is where, when those feet of the Levites who were carrying the ark suddenly touched the water, it says that the water immediately went all the way back to Adam. Because as if here was the beautiful idea of Christ and his work in reversing the effects that were brought upon mankind because of Adam, and then sin and death, which it was typified in the idea of the waters coming down from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. God's put a stop to that, and he sent it all the way back. He says, now I'm leading you into the promised land. I'm leading you into immortality because of the work of Christ. And so the ark was to go before them because, as Hebrews 6 tells us, Christ is our forerunner. And did you notice again that it went 3 days' journey? Numbers 10 tells us that when God was to lead them, he was to set a gap between the first and then those that would follow. And Christ, who is our first fruits, went through sin and death, and he was raised again. And on the third day, on that resurrection day, he was to become the very means by which every other person who is part of those armies, part of the one that he is the commander in chief, the captain of our salvation, Hebrews 2 says, would lead us out. That the effects of all the struggle and sorrow and tears that we go through in this mortality would be undone and taken back. So isn't it interesting that this idea in Numbers 10 about the ark going before them, 3 days' journey, is only again picked up here in Joshua chapter 3, when they were to be led into the promised land, into immortality itself. Brothers and sisters, that's the spiritual warfare that the Levites were trying to depict to that nation, that they had to let God lead in their life. And if we go back to Numbers chapter 10, have a think about some of the things that we're told here. 3 days, we know that that's picked up by Christ in the New Testament, but to search them out, notice this, a resting place, a place of rest, where truly, finally, sin and death being conquered, we can have that rest shared with God in that millennial age. So, brothers and sisters, there's the beauty of God's leadership and of the power in our life today. And you know, this phrase here, rise up, O Yahweh, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And when it rested, return, O Yahweh, to the many thousands of Israel. Those thousands are part of that army, part of those who were numbered, called out of sin and death and led into the promised land. Because the enemies, brothers and sisters, that God has scattered is the enemy of sin and death in our life. And the pain and the struggle that we all go through is, in a sense, the consequences of the fallen race to which we live in. But here is the certainty that I will be with you. I will rid that of you. I will bring you into the promised land. And as we trudge through those 38 years in the wilderness, brothers and sisters, we can be certain that as God would lead us day and night, we can be confident that God would rise up and scatter our enemies as it goes through. Now, I just want to quickly take us to two passages, and I'm sorry we're going a bit over time, but just come to two passages where this is mentioned, and we'll try and finish our exhortation here. But you know, David, I believe, understood these principles so amazingly. Just come to Psalm 68, because do you know, when David was gathering the nation together and he was bringing up the ark, think of this, he was bringing up the ark to make that the center and focus of his nation. It's interesting that there in Psalm 68 is the record of the psalm or the song that David wrote for this time. What did David think about when he brought the ark up? Well, look at verse 1 of Psalm 68. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, let them also that hate him flee before him. He's quoting, brothers and sisters, all the way back from Numbers chapter 10, because there is the whole concept of God actually leading and leading them through sin and death. And that's why he sings praises to God to extol him that rides in the heavens by his name Yah. We don't have time to look at this little connection there, but that word ride there is actually the word Rechab, by which the Rechabites came to be later in Jeremiah 34. But we can talk about that afterwards. But I want to just take you quickly to verse 17 of this psalm. The chariots of Yahweh, the host of God, are 20,000, even thousands of angels. The Lord is among them. I will be with you. I will lead you out. The Lord is among them, as in Sinai, in that holy place. We started right back in Exodus chapter 3, in the very place where God said, take off your shoes. I will lead you, Moses, and I will lead the people out. And then he says, thou hast ascended on high. Thou hast led captivity captive. Thou hast received gifts for men. Yea, for the rebellious also, that Yahweh Elohim might dwell among you. Blessed be the Lord, who daily loads us with benefits, even the God of our salvation. He that is our God is the God of salvation, and unto God the Lord belongs the issues from death. God will wound the head of his enemies, and the hairy scalp of such as one that goeth on still in his trespass. The Lord said, I will bring again from Bashan, I will bring my people again from the depths of the sea. There's all the themes, brothers and sisters. That is the themes of Numbers. And did you notice again that God would wound the head of his enemies? He's actually telling us that the exposition of Numbers chapter 10, when let God arise and his enemies be scattered, are the enemies of sin and death, because the head of the enemy is a direct link back to Genesis 3:15, where the serpent would be crushed in its head. You see, David's seeing this as a spiritual battle, a spiritual warfare that had to take place, and that God had actually given gifts. What were the gifts that God gave? It was the Levites. The Levites were to focus the people on the spiritual warfare. But we did say we just wanted to mention one more passage. Well, it's actually in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 4. And Ephesians 4, brothers and sisters, is where Paul quotes Psalm 68. And in Ephesians 4, let's read from verse 8, because it's talking about the wonderful things that God has done in our life. And so it says that there is, let's start from verse 6. There's one God and Father of all, who's above all and through all and in you all. But unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure, notice this, of the gift of Christ. You see, the Levites, brothers and sisters, and particularly the high priest, to which the whole idea of the Nazirite vow in Numbers 6 was to be a type of, was to actually tell us that the very thing that God was actually trying to teach them was that there would come one true high priest who would be the one who would defeat that battle. Truly, once and for all, crush it. A battle that they could not fight. A battle that they had to let God lead in. They would not be able to of themselves conquer sin and death. And so he says, wherefore he saith, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive. Notice he's quoting now from Psalm 68, but Paul changes it. He says, and he gave gifts unto men. So the Levites were given to God, brothers and sisters. As we come to remember the work of Christ, we come to remember the one who was given to God to declare his righteousness. But you know what God does? He gives that back to us. He's your gift. Because through the means of God's righteousness being demonstrated, God says, I'm going to make you righteous. I'm going to forgive you. the grace I'm going to extend to you. Because although you can't win that battle, if you're being called out and you're part of my army, then that commander-in-chief, the captain of your salvation, who has gone before you a day's journey, he's gone through that on your behalf. I will make you with him. I will link you to him. That is how you're going to enter into the promised land. I'm going to roll back all the effects of Adam, and I'm going to bring you greater blessings than were lost by Adam. I'm going to bring you to eternal life in the kingdom. So, brothers and sisters, when we come to remember this morning the wonderful blessings of let God arise, that's something that we can say day by day when we're going through those battles. Let God arise. Let his enemies be scattered. Let those that hate him flee before him. Because it's not just helping us work through life's challenges, it's also helping us understand that God is leading us. And he's going to lead us to the certainty of that promised land. So as we come to partake of the emblems, brothers and sisters, let's remember the captain of our salvation who was given to God, and yet God gave him back to us. And you know what's beautiful, brothers and sisters, is that those words in Isaiah 40, is that the great comfort that God extends to us is the comfort that our warfare, same word, is accomplished. And it's accomplished because God provided the very servant by which that should take place. So let's try and look forward to that day where our resting place will be assured. Let us return to the many thousands of Israel. And as our Lord said, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.